Subscribe to The Crime Desk now for exclusive members-only trial episodes and much more. Just head over to thecrimedesk.com now. That's thecrimedesk.com.
The Crime Desk. Arresting podcasts.
Welcome to the trial podcast, The Inquiry. I'm Caroline Cheetham.
And I'm Liz Hull.
Hi everyone, Caroline and Liz here. A quick one to let you know some exciting news. We get such great feedback from all of our listeners all the time, and we so love hearing from you.
Everyone's been so invested in all the cases we've covered so far. And of course, we're going to keep on bringing you more trials from across the UK and beyond on the usual feed.
But we get so many requests to cover even more cases or to answer questions about the trials that we're covering. So that's what we're going to do, which is what's so exciting.
We're launching the Trial Plus, which will be for members only.
And what the Trial Plus will be doing is bringing you some of the content that we can't always bring you on the trial.
We'll be looking at other significant cases from across the world, and we'll also be bringing you more in-depth reporting of the trials we've been covering on the main feed.
Coming up in the first couple of weeks, we're going to be chatting about celebrity cases and what happened when celebs find themselves in court. But to kick it off, we've got a special series about the Lucy Letby case.
We're not going to tell you much more about that here, but it's well worth subscribing if you've been following that one.
These episodes are going to be exclusive to the Trial Plus members only. So if you're listening to the trial now, just scroll up and hit the subscribe button or visit thecrimedesk.com. We'd love you to join us.
May 23rd, 1862. The soldiers of the 1st Maryland Infantry Regiment are on the lines, both of them. Though the blue and gray uniforms of the Confederacy and Union divide these men, they are all Marylanders, neighbors, colleagues, even brothers, fighting it out in a battle that perfectly captures the most poignant reality of a nation at war with itself. Join me, Don Wildman, on American History Hit as we return to the battlefields of the Civil War. Why did this war begin? How was it fought? And how did it all pan out? American History Hit, a podcast from History Hit. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
I make it absolutely clear that it's not for me as chair of this public
The decision to move Letby to day shifts raises serious questions which we will be investigating. Was there a cover-up? If so, why?
I would pray for God to save her. He did. He saved
The
her.
conviction stand.
But the devil found her.
In August 2023, a neonatal nurse called Lucy Letby was convicted of killing and harming 13 babies in her care. She was sentenced to 14 life terms and declared one of the country's most prolific serial killers. A year later, she was convicted of attempting to kill another baby and given another life sentence.
All this happened in the Countess of Chester Hospital over the course of a year from 2015 to 2016. But what went wrong? Who knew what and when? How was a nurse able to kill and hurt babies on a ward under the noses of her colleagues?
The Thirlwall inquiry is now underway in Liverpool and will attempt to answer these questions and more. We'll be there covering events every day.
So it's the final day of submissions today to Lady Justice Thirlwall. Yesterday, we heard from a range of barristers. The most striking words really came from the Department of Health and from the Countess of Chester Hospital, which essentially admitted responsibility for some significant failures. Now, we covered all of that in our update episode yesterday, so have a listen if you want to catch up on that. But today it was a turn of the barristers for the senior executives from the hospital and for the barristers of some of the babies.
Welcome to episode 28, The Cover-Up.
Now, we should say, first of all, we're recording this from a bit of an echoey building not far from Liverpool Town Hall. We got thrown out of there a few minutes ago because they've got an event tonight. So normally they're very, very kind and they let us record as the inquiry finishes for the day. But today they kicked us all out because they've got an event. So we sound a bit echoey. You know why. But just to start with that title episode, we've called it The Cover-Up because that's what Richard Baker KC, who's the barrister who represents 9 of the families in this case, called it. He said the behaviour of some of the senior managers was just that, a cover-up. He said babies were allowed to die or be harmed because of a failure to identify that crimes were being committed and to stop them. He said the trust and leaders put reputation ahead of patient safety. A culture that should have prioritised safety failed. The trust and its leaders, he went on, lied to the families. They misled the external organisations. They misled their own board of directors. And ultimately, they tried to avoid a police investigation at all costs. They also persecuted and bullied those who brought those issues to their attention. And his words certainly got all of our attention in Liverpool today. We'll come to everything else that he had to say shortly. And it's fair to say he was eviscerating of some of the senior managers, him and the other barrister in this case as well, Peter Skelton. But before we come to their full criticisms, we should start, Liz, with what the senior managers had to say, because we did hear from them first of all.
Yeah, so we're going to tip this episode on its head a bit by starting with some of the words from those senior managers. Kate Blackwell KC is their barrister. She represents the former chief executive, Tony Chambers, the ex-medical director, Ian Harvey, the former director of nursing, Alison Kelly, and the ex-head of HR, Sue Hodkinson. They were all the leaders at the Countess of Chester Hospital during 2015 and 2016, when, as we know, Lucy Letby was harming and killing the babies she was caring for. And Miss Blackwell started by saying the senior managers apologised to the families of the babies for any hurt and anxiety that they'd suffered, and they admitted that they got some things wrong. They accepted they could have and should have communicated better with them, but they insisted they never intended to keep them in the dark about what was going on, although she did say that they now accept that their actions were misguided. She said they know now that they should have involved the police sooner, but they claimed it was never expressed to them in stark terms that Lucy Letby was causing deliberate harm before June 2016. And by saying that, they actually disagreed with what we heard yesterday from the Department of Health, when they said that Lucy Letby should have been removed from the unit as early as October 2015, after the death of the 5th baby in the case, baby I. Miss Blackwell said the manager's concern was to go to the police at the right time, and they felt they needed to make sure other factors had been eliminated first. She also said Ian Harvey never tried not to go to the police, but she also accepted that the senior managers had clear advice from their legal advisor, Stephen Cross, who told them calling in the police would have serious consequences for the hospital. And she also raised questions about how clear the consultants had actually been about raising their concerns. She claimed any reference to an association with Lucy Letby and the collapses and deaths on the unit were centred, even as late as 2016, on protecting her welfare, rather than linking them to any allegations that she was in fact responsible for deliberate harm.
Yeah, and she said, for example, that Dr. Stephen Breary, who we know was in charge of the neonatal unit, was unclear about when exactly his suspicions began to crystallise. And she said after the death of baby I in October 2015, his review had initially put her death down to natural causes. And she questioned why he didn't contact the police himself, and said there'd been no evidence that he asked for an urgent meeting with Ian Harvey in February 2016, as he said in the inquiry. She also said the picture was even less clear when it came to Dr. Ravi Jairam, because she said he changed his story about what happened to baby K in February 2016. And so she questioned why. If he was so worried that baby K's breathing tube may have been dislodged deliberately, had he waited more than 12 months until March 2017 before he raised it with anyone? She went on then to question why he didn't raise his concerns about Lucy Letby to the coroner at an inquest that he attended. In fact, she said, before the death of baby P in June 2016, The deaths were being treated by everyone, the clinicians, the managers and the nurses, as explicable by a combination of issues around care and natural illness. And she alleged that some recollections given to the inquiry may have been tainted by hindsight bias. Basically, she's saying that the witnesses were now aware of the convictions of Lucy Letby, and that may have tainted their evidence.
Yeah, there were some areas where the managers now accepted wrongdoing, however, Ms. Blackwell said. Safeguarding policies had not been followed, but should have been. She said they accepted Lucy Letby's employment grievance should have been paused while the investigations into the spike in deaths were ongoing. And she said they agreed that there had been a breakdown in the relationships between managers and doctors, and more should have been done to support the consultants when they were under such intense pressure. She also said the managers were concerned about some of the questioning they'd faced during the inquiry, which she said had accused them of deliberately and knowingly protecting a murderer, which she said they vociferously denied.
Yeah, so then she turned to her request, her application, if you like, to pause this inquiry, which we know she wrote to Lady Justice Thirlwall about last month, and we talked about it briefly in the episode yesterday. Now, she said the reason she's now applying for the inquiry to effectively be paused is because there is now what she called a real possibility that the Criminal Cases Review Commission could refer Lucy Letby's convictions back to the Court of Appeal and they could be quashed. And on that basis, she said, it would be unfair to carry on with the inquiry. She said the convictions for multiple murder and attempted murder were the cornerstone of the inquiry, the bedrock, if you like, that it's been founded on. And given there are now what she said were these real concerns that Lucy Letby had been wrongly convicted, it would be unfair for the inquiry to progress any further in assessing the actions of midwives, nurses, and senior managers.
She also insisted the senior managers were not making this application in an attempt to evade accountability. In fact, she said even if Lucy Letby's convictions were quashed, questions would remain for them. So she urged Lady Justice Thirlwall to pause the inquiry, saying the failure to do so would be to ignore what was happening in the real world outside these doors.
If this inquiry is a search for the truth, then, my lady, there is now, it seems, evidence being provided to the CCRC that the causes of death may be different, that the juries in the Crown Court proceedings may have been presented with a misleading and incomplete picture, and this inquiry should consider carefully, we respectfully submit, before producing on a report based upon the bedrock of Letby's convictions. Whilst the awaited decision of the CCRC cannot be predicted in time or decision, the increasing concern expressed by world-class experts that the prosecution case was based on medical misunderstandings and poor expert evidence, and other concerns raised that evidence was withheld from the jury, are in real danger of dissolving that bedrock into a beach of shifting sands.
But as you might imagine, her application to pause the inquiry was strongly opposed by the barristers who represent the families of the babies. And this was led by Peter Skelton, KC. Now, he represents 5 of the families of babies killed and harmed. Now, he urged Lady Justice Thirlwall to continue her work. He said Lucy Letby had been convicted after a protracted trial where she'd had access to the best legal advice and numerous medical experts. He said despite what Miss Blackwell had said about the merits of her submission to the CCRC, a cursory glance at the evidence which was presented in that recent press conference by her new barrister, Mark MacDonald, showed it was old and full of analytical holes. He said critical medical and non-medical evidence hadn't been mentioned, and he said little or no thought had been given to the dignity and the privacy of the families and the babies that the experts have publicly been discussing. He also said despite all of the fanfare, the bells and whistles that have been associated with these press conferences, it was based on fragile towers of speculation and was nothing new.
Now, Richard Baker, who represents 9 of the families and who we started the episode with today, also supported Mr. Skelton's argument. He said that from the moment Lucy Letby was accused of harming children back in June 2015, she'd tried to play the victim. She'd sought support of others and cynically tried to manipulate the narrative for her own ends. He said the families had seen nothing different in her behaviour since her convictions, her 2 failed appeals, the press conferences with the experts, and now the attempts to pause the inquiry were all her way of trying to exert control.
From the moment that she faced accusations at the Countess of Chester Hospital, Lucy Letby cynically tried to change the narrative away from the suspicions that were levelled against her by pleading for her own victimhood and seeking to recruit others to support her. The families see nothing different in the approach taken in response to appeals, nothing different in a decision to hold a press conference just before Christmas, and nothing different in decisions to hold press conferences during pauses in this inquiry.
And he said the purpose of the inquiry was never to assess whether Lucy Letby's convictions were sound. He also insisted its findings will be valuable, whatever the decision of the CCRC or any subsequent appeal. He said what the senior managers did or didn't do when the doctors started raising concerns would also be relevant regardless. And like Mr. Skelton, Mr. Baker also questioned the newness and the quality of the evidence that's been put forward by this expert panel and by Lucy Letby's defence team.
Yes, he did, Caroline, and he said that despite the blaze of publicity, there was in fact nothing new or remarkable in the detail of these expert reports that hadn't already been rehearsed before the jury at Lucy Letby's trials. And he pointed out that the elephant in the room was the fact that Mr. MacDonald had refused to reveal exactly why Lucy Letby failed to call any experts and only called a plumber in her own defence at her original trial.
It is, we're afraid, a question that needs to be answered. The only reason why a defendant would choose not to call their own experts to give evidence is because they know that those experts, if tested in court, would be likely to convict them. A defendant cannot choose not to call their experts at trial and then ask for permission to roll the dice again when the gamble doesn't pay off.
Yeah, and he said it was fanciful that the CCRC would be able to quickly assess her case or that pausing the inquiry would save money, given that it was almost at an end. He also said the families he represents weren't linked in any way before 2015 and 2016, but they all now collectively carried the permanent scars of what they'd been through and what they'd suffered because of Lucy Letby's actions. They've bravely sat together through 2 trials, 2 failed appeals and the inquiry and shared one common goal, he said, to discover the truth and achieve justice for their children, but also to make sure no other families suffer the same harm that they've suffered.
Their common voice before this inquiry has been a plea to ensure that this should never happen again.
And he said whatever side of the debate people were on, they should remember that the babies who died and were harmed were not public property to be dissected on television or the internet. And while their anonymity was important, it had dehumanised them in the eyes of the public, he said, even more so now than when the inquiry first started.
We'll be back after this short break.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Now, before the break, Richard Baker had reminded everyone that the families are at the centre of this case. And he also said that it was not in doubt that the NHS needed to do better. And he outlined his damning list of failings. poor systems in place for investigating unusual deaths, a failure to react to unusual blood tests, a failure of safeguarding structures, a failure to listen to concerns when they were raised, and a deliberate cover-up, a suppression of evidence and a lack of candour, and a persecution of whistleblowers.
The message coming through the evidence is that there was a total and absolute failure of culture at the Countess of Chester Hospital, and on the part of individuals, a total failure to meet the basic standards to be expected of senior, powerful, and well-paid NHS executives.
He said such failings cannot be allowed to continue in the NHS and lessons must be learned to stop history repeating itself. But he also said something that we've covered on the podcast before, that given the NHS's track record for not acting on recommendations of previous public inquiries, the families had no hope that anything would change.
But in order to learn lessons, the mistakes have to be acknowledged. And he said there was a bright line in the timeline following the attack on baby F, who was poisoned with insulin by Lucy Letby. And after this point, no harm should have been allowed to occur. We know that a consultant did look at his blood test results, but then dismissed them. And Mr. Baker said the blood test was clear evidence that a malevolent force was at work, and the failure to act on that test was a significant missed opportunity.
He also said that he did agree with the submission of the hospital yesterday that Lucy Letby should have been suspended after baby I's death in October 2015, when there were then active suspicions about her being present at the previous 5 baby deaths. He also said it was difficult to understand why Dr. Jairam had not acted more decisively following the death of baby K, which of course happened in February 2016. And then it was a month or two later when the families believed the executives began to learn about the suspicions, but made the decision to watch and wait. A decision he said cost at least 2 babies' lives and led to others being irrevocably altered.
Mr. Baker then turned his attention to the 3 most senior managers in charge at the time. And as we said at the start of the episode, Caroline, it's fair to say he didn't hold back in his complete condemnation of their decisions and their behaviour at the inquiry when they gave their evidence. He said Tony Chambers' performance in the witness box was poor, and he urged Lady Justice Thirlwall to disregard anything he'd said that had not been corroborated by other witnesses. He described him as combative, angry, and lacking in insight. He said he avoided answering questions that didn't fit his prepared narrative, and he called him dishonest. He said his performance made it easy to understand the accounts given by the doctors of his bullying and intimidating behaviour. And he said Mr. Chambers had failed to accept responsibility. His apologies were only given with caveats, and he was biologically instinctive towards self-preservation.
Yeah, he also said the fact that he'd made it to the position of chief executive in the NHS was of the gravest concern to the families. And he also accused him of spearheading the cover-up and said he resisted calling in the police right up to the point that he had absolutely no choice. Mr. Baker was equally critical of the actions of Ian Harvey and Alison Kelly. He said Mr. Harvey misled the external reviewers, but worse, he lied to the mum of baby C and falsely reassured her when he was already aware that Lucy Letby was under suspicion.
Mr. Baker said Alison Kelly was also unimpressive. She'd failed to take responsibility and also sought to blame others. In short, he said the behaviour of all 3 of them in seeking to pause the inquiry in order to avoid criticism was typical of their general attitude.
Yeah, and he concluded his submissions by saying, actually, lessons will be learned is probably now not enough. He said now is the time for something tangible, to focus the minds on prioritising patient safety and what he called proper change. And that, he said, should be focused on the regulation of senior managers in the NHS, which again we heard about yesterday from the Department of Health. We know that is currently being consulted on. He said, it's the only way forward.
So the tone of Mr. Baker's closing statement was also echoed by Peter Skelton KC. He said the babies and their families were failed at every stage by the hospital and staff, who time and again didn't have the moral courage to properly report deaths and collapses, to clearly articulate concerns, and ultimately to act much sooner to prevent Lucy Letby from killing and harming children. He said it didn't require a sophisticated risk assessment to know that if there's the remotest possibility that a murder's been committed in a hospital, urgent intervention is required in order to protect other patients and stop the culprit. He said everyone has a responsibility for safeguarding, and nothing can be allowed to stand in the way of sharing information to take steps to protect the safety of children.
Yeah, and he also laid some of what he called the gravest failures at the door of the medical staff who didn't notify the police or initiate safeguarding procedures and remove Lucy Letby from the unit when they first became concerned. And he reminded Lady Justice Thirlwall that the possibility of murder was already being considered at the Countess from July 2015 onwards. And he said at this point, it was the healthcare professionals who failed to exercise common sense or have enough moral courage. He said it was understandable that the consultants initially doubted their own judgments.
They were worried they might be wrong and that they would be accused of bullying Lucy Letby. He also said misplaced worry was planted and exploited by Stephen Cross, who, you'll remember, was a former police officer and had warned the executives that the unit could become a crime scene if they called in the police. He also said the doctors had concerns they would find themselves criticised and ostracised. He said their worst case scenario was the loss of their jobs and careers. Of course, some of their concerns proved to be right by their treatment at the hands of the senior managers, but it didn't make it understandable, Mr. Skelton said, that the police were not called in sooner. He said explanations could not stand as excuses.
And similar to Mr. Baker, he also pointed out the litany of missed opportunities. The consultants who failed to recognise that the deaths of babies A, B and D in June 2015 should have been considered and looked at together, that they warranted a joined-up investigation. The continued failure on the part of the consultants and junior managers to contact the police and initiate safeguarding processes and remove Lucy Letby after July 2015 became what he said was more acute and indefensible as time went on, and more babies were harmed and died. And he reminded the inquiry that conversations about murder were taking place after October 2015, when baby I repeatedly collapsed and eventually died. But nothing was done, and even, he said, after the death of baby O and P in June 2016, when the consultants finally insisted that Lucy Letby should be removed from the unit, neither they nor anyone else contacted the police or start those safeguarding processes.
So Mr. Skelton was critical of some of the medical staff, of delays and of the systematic failures in reporting, or what he called the lack of joined-up thinking. But like Mr. Baker, he saved his most stinging criticism for the senior managers. He said Alison Kelly and Ian Harvey had not got a grip on the situation. They'd failed to understand and haven't grasped, he said, why the consultants were unable to say what they really feared was going on. They put too much reliance on what he called the convenient explanations from senior nurses that Lucy Letby was the wronged party. Worse though, he said, critical information about the spike in deaths was withheld. Consultants were muted. The focus instead was on reputational management and a fear of external scrutiny. Ian Harvey, he said, tightly controlled all the external reviews. He deliberately withheld information from the reviewers and refused to seek help from the consultants. Finally, and most egregiously, he said, Ian Harvey misrepresented the reviewers' findings to his own hospital board, which ultimately reassured them that Lucy Letby was the injured party and the consultants were the problem. He also said the board members, who he described as weak and lacking in curiosity, never heard directly from the consultants themselves, and there'd been a deliberate strategy to keep the board and the consultants apart in order to avoid police involvement.
It's often the way in public inquiries, as it is in other legal proceedings, that particular opprobrium attaches to those participants and witnesses who show the least insight into their own actions and motivations, who cannot bring themselves to take responsibility for their own mistakes, who seek to blame others, and who try, to the end, to avoid being held personally accountable for what went wrong. So it is with the Countess of Chester Hospital's executives in this inquiry, Tony Chambers, Ian Harvey, Alison Kelly, and Sue Hodkinson. In their evidence and in the submissions made by their counsel to this inquiry, they appear to have lived in, and to still be living in, an alternate and internally contradictory reality. One where no murders and attempted murders occurred, or if they did, the executives did everything reasonably in their power to protect patient safety, and it wasn't their fault because no one else told them or stopped them from happening. This is arrogant, self-serving fantasy.
Okay, we should say before we wrap up for today that our special series, which focuses on what was happening at the Countess of Chester, specifically in relation to the senior managers, starts tomorrow. Much of what has been said today by Mr. Baker and Mr. Skelton will be echoed by what we've also found about the actions of some of those senior managers. I should say actions and at times inactions, their lack of experience, their poor decision making, and ultimately how some of what they've told the inquiry simply doesn't add up. That's not us saying it. It's the conclusions of this independent investigation into the hospital, which we're going to be bringing you tomorrow. Please do subscribe to thetrialplus.com and have a listen to that. It's the first of a number of special episodes that we're going to be bringing you, which takes a bit of a closer look at some of the cases that we're covering on the trial. We'd love to grow our Trial and Trial Plus community, so please do subscribe if you can. But before we finish today, we wanted to mention that the barristers also explained quite a bit more about what the families have endured and are still enduring. This piece in particular was written by the mum of baby D. Baby D was a baby girl. She was born full term and she was murdered by Lucy Letby. We've used an actor to voice up her words.
It is one hurtful realisation to come face to face with evil, the one that took my child's life. Another, to be in the dark, waiting for a consideration, an investigation, a trial, a jury to decide, a judge to sentence. And then an inquiry to get answers to years of questions, all topped by the noise from ill and misinformed people out there. Not one day of peace. Ever again. There was life before. And then hell broke loose. And life was never going to feel okay. To process the fact that one human has decided to attack, torture, and kill our babies. How can we ever feel safe or trust again? To later find out this murderer had the support, sympathy, and full protection from an army of people that allowed for more victims. The people who failed us are responsible for the deaths of our children too. These people had a chance to speak up, explain to us what happened, and still, after everything we know now, they didn't manage to sincerely apologise for their failure. They don't half recognise their mistakes. At the end of this inquiry, having heard far too many failings, we're left let down, disgusted, and even more sad than before. Finding out so many missed opportunities, listening to lies and facing the arrogance of the team of managers and chief executives will forever haunt me and weigh me down. I would like to remind every single person who hears or reads our message, we are here today because our babies lost their lives. My baby died. My child did not survive the attacks, and my heart did not make it through either. I'm deeply affected every day and broken beyond my tears. Thank you.
So that's it for today from both things happening inside and outside this inquiry. We're expecting the inquiry to probably wrap up tomorrow, and we may even get a ruling from Lady Justice Thirlwall on the application from Kate Blackwell to pause the inquiry. We know she has to consult with the Secretary of State, so that's Wes Streeting. And if we do get a ruling on that tomorrow, we will bring it to you.
As usual, you can follow us at The Trial Pod on Instagram and on TikTok at Daily Mail Crime.
You can leave a comment on Spotify or send us a voice note on WhatsApp on 07796 657 512. Start your message with the word trial.
See you then.